It's time to add the backing and the binding to the Twilight Boulevard bench pillow. I'm ready to add the backing, and I am going to put the backing right side down with the wrong side facing the wrong side of the quilt. I do not add an extra layer of batting. I just don't feel it needs it for a wall hanging, but you could easily add another layer if you wanted to. Now, my original plan was to do something similar as I did the Automakers, and that was to use the backing as a self-binding and, cut it a little bit larger after I stitch in the ditch and get it attached. Fold it twice, and then that becomes the binding to sew around. And I was really looking forward to that, but that doesn't seem like it's going to work with this piece of fabric that I have. It's not straight, and so while I would probably have a thinner binding than I did for the Automakers, I just don't think it's going to work with this piece. If I leave enough room in some spots, like it's quite large at the top, but then you can see that towards the end it's just not straight, and so I only have a little piece, and that's not going to work. And the same with this side. If I make it large enough, then there just isn't enough on this side. So my fabric just doesn't seem square. Maybe I'll try to re-iron it. If I can get it where I have at least 3/4 of an inch, I could have just a really thin self-binding, and I would like that, so I may try to do that. But my first step, whether that works or not, is to go ahead and stitch in the ditch. I added pins so that I can keep the backing on when I stitch in the ditch, and I was not able to work this out for self-binding. You might be able to see that I have a curve, and so it's wider out here. You can see how much I have out here. It kind of dips in the center. I barely have any here, maybe 1/2 an inch, and then it kind of goes back up where it's more at this end, and then on the other side it's just the opposite. So I kind of have a cut where you can see this really dips down. That was just cut not straight. So I have a lot in the center, and it's just the opposite of the top. Then when I come to the side or the edge, I barely have any. And so that is not going to work for self-binding, but that's okay. Here is the thread I'm using. It's monopoly. It's by Superior Threads. I am just using clear for the top as well as the bobbin. Even though this has dark fabrics, I am not going to use the smoke color. I think the clear will look better because I do have a lot of lighter fabrics as well. And I do want to mention that I have done a lot of stitch in the ditch. I have done a lot of projects, and this is my first bobbin that I'm coming to an end. You can see here is I just got the pre-wound bobbins, and this is my first bobbin that I've used up. So this goes a long way for the bobbin. All right, so what I'm going to do is, again, just stitch first in all of the seams down the center blocks. I'll come stitch each edge of the inner borders, and then along each of the patchwork, and then around the perimeter of the whole quilt. Now let me show you what I'm going to do with the ties to hang this quilt. So I am doing regular binding, and so what I am going to do with my ties is finish just one edge of my ties. I have 4 strips that are 2.5 inches wide by 8 inches tall. And let me show you how I'm going to sew these. I have my 4 pieces, and I've started to prep them. I have pressed them wrong sides together in half, and I've pressed a crease down the center. Then I opened that back up, pressed each long edge to meet that center crease, and pressed. And then eventually this will be folded in half again, and then top stitch, and I will have the cute little hanging tabs. Now for other little hanging tabs or hanging ties, the directions that I used said to take one of the short ends, fold it down, and then fold just like we press, so the ends, the long edges in towards the center, then fold that in half, and then one end, there's no raw edges. This end has raw edges because that will be sewn into the binding. But I find that this adds a lot of bulk, and it's not, you know, the cleanest. I've done this many times, but you can see there are several layers. There's, you know, two here that open up, and then two here. And so it's just not the cleanest. And so recently I came across a different way to sew these, and I used these for one of my projects the last time I did ties like this, and I loved it. And it was clean and it's easy. It's actually easier than, you saw how kind of fiddly it is to fold and fold in and keep everything as straight as you can. So what I'm going to do is I am going to flip this right side up. Now remember, I have creased it, so my creases are towards the wrong side, and I'm going to be folding it and sewing it the opposite of the creases. But it leaves such a clean edge. It's super, and it's super fast. All right, so with the right side up, I'm going to fold this in half. Now I'm not going to press, I'm just going to hold it, because again my creases are going the opposite way. So I have folded this in half, and then I'm going to take this and fold it in half again. So I have the open edges at the top, I have my fold down here. I'm just going to take this again with the fold up and fold it in half one more time, like that. Then I'm just going to stitch 1/4 of an inch across that end. And I'm going to do that, of course, on all four, just on one end. All right, let's go ahead and get those sewn as well as stitch in the ditch. I have all of the stitch in the ditch done, and so I will just take my ruler and trim all of the excess backing off. And I did do the outer with just white thread, and of course all of my stitch in the ditch is the clear. So that is my next step with the quilt top. And for the ties, I just need to turn them and then repress them and top stitch. So how this works is it needs to be turned twice the way that we did this. And so what I normally do is just take the open edge and kind of pull, and that would be the first, and that leaves you with this inside and then kind of a big hole. And so then to take the second turn, I usually just put my thumbs in that little hole that it makes and then flip it again, and then press my nail up, or a pointing tool, and that gets the nice sharp edge that doesn't have all those layers of folds, and it looks so clean. It's so easy. And now I will just take this back to my iron and press, and you can see how helpful it is to pre-press. So I will just take this, it's already creased, I'll refold it and press, and then I have a nice clean tie, and I will top stitch. So my plan was to use this small polka dot fabric that we used in the quilt, and it's the same fabric I use for my ties, but I don't have enough. I am barely short, and so I was thinking of maybe doing super small, like 2-inch binding. But then I found this larger polka dot. It's not something we used in the quilt, but of course it's similar. And I have a width of fabric, so I have enough to do my regular 2 1/4. And I know that sounds like it's not a big difference between 2-inch and 2 1/4, but actually 2 1/4 is a little bit smaller than most people use for binding. So I'm already on the small side, and so I think I'm just going to use this larger polka dot. Now, if I would have been smart and thought about this earlier, I would have probably done my ties in the same fabric, or maybe cut this off first and use the purple, but I'm just going to use what I have. And again, I am using binding, but that's not what the directions call for. The directions call for that purple to be an envelope backing, and there's no binding in this project as the directions call for, and so that's why I'm having to find something that will work for binding. So I'm going to go ahead and use this large polka dot. I'm going to cut 2 1/4 inch strips. I think I'll only need 3. So I'm going to cut 3 and see if that will work. I haven't done the math, but a width of fabric is usually 41 inches. My quilt is about 38.5, so say 39. So one width of fabric will go along the top, one along the bottom, and then I think one width of fabric should be enough. I think it's only 16 inches tall, my quilt, and so I'm only going to cut 3 pieces, and I'll just put the rest aside. All right, so I'm going to get these cut to 2 1/4, and we'll start on the binding. For the binding, I cut the strips and I cut the selvages off, so now I'm ready just to sew these so there'll be one continuous binding. So I put right sides together from the ends of 2 strips. I've marked where the bottom corner is. I'm going to stitch from corner to corner. Normally I don't use a marking down the center. I will have a seam guide on, or I just kind of eye it at such a short amount. But you can just, again, shoot for that bottom corner and then mark a line from the top corner down to that bottom. And then I'll have a line to sew on. Then, of course, the next, I'll take the bottom of this strip, take my third piece, I'll put that right side up and do the exact same thing. And then sew these, trim off 1/4 of an inch from the seam, and I will press that seam open, and then I will press this in half. So I've sewn both those seams, and I just chain piece, and so I will cut these apart, and then when these of course open up, it just looks like one continuous piece of binding, just like any other binding. Now I don't measure and I don't use a rotary cutter. I'm just going to trim about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to go press that seam open. And same thing with this one. And then I'll press in half. I pressed my binding in half, and I'm getting ready to stitch it to the back of my quilt. I'm just starting towards one end. This is the right side of my quilt. I'm just starting a couple inches from the corner. I'm going to start sewing about where this first patchwork border is. Just that's a good place to start. I'm leaving a long tail so that when I come back around, it will allow for easier time sewing the binding. Now at the start, I did press this right side up to the top. So this is a 45-degree angle, and I did press with an iron. I'm going to be using that crease when I join my binding. It's a super fast, easy way. There's no measuring, and I've been using this since I found this method, and I really like it. So I have about a 12-inch tail. You can do a little bit less if you want. I just like more, so it's easier to work with at the sewing machine. So I'm going to start and show you how easy it is to do the corners, just like typical binding. Now, since I have ties to add, which I did top stitch these with, it's actually a charcoal thread. I used a black for the bobbin, and I have a really close top stitch, and I am using a 70-10 needle. I've done that for all of my piecing, and the thread that I have been using to sew things together in my embroidery projects as well as just regular quilting, I have been using the 80 weight Deco Bob, and it is a super thin thread, but it has the strength of like a 40 weight, so it's half the size of a 40 weight thread, so it's super thin, but it's got the strength of a 40 weight. And you might be able to see it's you know, hardly visible. And so I have top stitched all my ties, and I need to place them on the top of my quilt. I have been placing them for my bench pillows that I turn into wall hangings about 4 inches in, which is around this seam between the first two little patchwork borders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end that is raw, and I'm going to place the raw edge to the raw edge, and I'm going to line up one. It's hard to see because of the clear thread, but here's my seam right here. I'm just going to place one next to that stitching. I'll take my next piece, and I'm just going to look and see, place that to the other side so that that seam that goes between those two patchwork borders is right down the center of these two. And then when I come around and I'm sewing my binding, I am going to tack these down first before I start sewing the binding, just so that I don't have to clip them or you know, anything like that. So then when I come around with my binding, that will just get sewn in to the binding. So that's how I'm going to attach both sets of little ties right at that seam. All right, so I'm going to do that first, but then once I get those tacked down, I will just start and sew 1/4 of an inch, and I'll show you how to do the corners, but it's the same as any other corners. I will stop about 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the quilt, and I will just fold back like this. This will make a 45-degree angle, and you can tell that you have the right angle when these line up in a straight line. You wouldn't want this, you know, the angle to be so that would be coming off here or coming down. And that helps you know that that is a 45-degree angle. Now you don't have to lay it out like this at your machine. As long as you fold it up and you can see that that's going in a straight line, that's usually sufficient. And then I'm going to fold this piece back and continue sewing. This fold will be along that edge that I just sewed. All right, so let's go get this started. Now I mentioned I was going to sew the binding on with a 1/4 inch seam, and I forgot that I've been working on my binding and I'm trying something new, and so I'm actually sewing just a little bit bigger than 1/4 of an inch. On my machine, I moved my needle so it's not in the center position. It is at a 4.5 millimeter, which means that it's moved over towards the right. I'm using this open toe foot. I am going to line the outside of this foot with my binding, and again, it's my needle's slightly over. On my machine, if my width is set to 3.5, that is the center position. I moved it over 2 notches to 4.5, so it's just a little bit bigger than 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to sew about and stop about the same amount, so a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch. Normally you would sew to 1/4 of an inch when you're doing binding. If you're sewing 1/4 of an inch, since mine's a little bit larger, I'm going to stop a little bit bigger or a little bit sooner than the end of my quilt. I hope that makes sense. And I'm just trying different techniques, trying to, again, work on my binding. And so this is the 3rd time that I've done something a little bit different than a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to try it. All right, so I'm just going to stitch. I'm going to back stitch when I get just towards the end, and then I'll show you the corner. So I back stitch and cut my thread. Again, I'm a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch from my edge, and I'm going to fold this back. And I like to turn my quilt so that I'm kind of headed in the direction that I'm going to be sewing, and then I don't have to put clips. I can, but usually I can get this under my needle without disturbing my corner if I'm kind of already headed in that direction, versus stopping, sewing, doing my corner, and then trying to turn my whole quilt. So I've just pivoted my quilt, and I'm just going to, again, I'm going to kind of hold my finger down here. I'm going to lift up so that the edge lines up nicely with the edge that I'm going to sew. That should make about a 45-degree angle. And then I will fold this back on itself. That fold should line up right with the edge that I just sewed. And I'm ready to sew. Now I could add a clip if I wanted to make sure that, you know, it doesn't move when I go to my needle. But normally if I'm already have my whole quilt turned, that's usually not an issue. All right, so I'm going to line it up with, again, the outside of this foot and just continue sewing, and I will sew down, again, just a little bit larger than 1/4 of an inch at the edge of my quilt, and do the exact same thing for the rest of the corners. So I stopped sewing about 15 inches from where I started, and I backstitched and cut my thread. So now I need to join these, and this piece that I started with, I am just going to lay flat like I would sew it. I just want to make sure that it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to open this up, keeping it flat. And I'm going to put a couple of clips just to keep it so that it doesn't move when I'm folding this side. Now I have this piece that I creased, and I'm going to keep it folded for now. This, when it lays flat, this will be a 45-degree. This is just straight up and down. I'll take the piece that I just ended, again, lay it flat like I would sew it, and then I'm going to fold this back on itself, and I am going to line that fold of this piece that I ended with, and I want to make it parallel to this piece that I folded up, to this edge right here. But I don't want the fold to come to the edge. So I have, again, this folded up. I have this nice and flat that I will sew to the edge, and then I will fold this piece back on itself with this fold being parallel to that, but not all the way to meet that edge. In fact, I'm going to make a little bit bigger gap. So there's maybe 1/8 of an inch. So you can see where this polka dot is. And you can see that I have about half of that covered up. My fold for this piece is not quite to the edge. Then I'm going to just finger press this because I need that crease, and then I can just cut it. So I don't need the crease, but it's easier sometimes to cut when you crease it. So now I'm going to cut that fold. So this is what it looks like. So this lays flat. It's parallel to that, but it doesn't reach the end. I hope you can see that. Now what I need to do is open this piece. So there is probably an easier way to see the amount of gap that I left. Now I want to take these two top corners, and I do want them to meet. So I can remove this, and I do want those to meet. And to make this easier, because we're going to sew a diagonal seam just like we did when we did our binding, and it will be identical. So what I'm going to do is take a clip. I'll take this one, and I'm just going to pleat my quilt so that I can work with these. And this is why I leave them a little bit longer. So here is that corner that I lined up. So now I want to line that up. These were the edges that were not lined up. They were short, but now I want them to line up. I want the tops to line up, and I want the edges to line up. Now if I flip this over, this looks exactly like our strips that we sewed together for the binding. And this crease that I pressed in, this was the very start, is what I sew on. So I don't have to mark it because of course it's a little bit harder to mark. And now this is exactly like the binding, but it's such a good technique. There's no measuring. You don't have to do all these complicated things to get this diagonal seam. So now I just need to sew that. Now before I can sew this, I need to move my needle, since I have been stitching with it moved over just a little bit. So I'm just going to put it back to the center and then line up that crease and sew right down. Now, no matter what way I do binding, before I trim this, I always double check that I sewed it correctly, because if I were just to cut this and then found out that for some reason I got one twisted or I sewed them wrong, I would have to add fabric back and then rejoin the binding. So what I do is, so here's my piece that I just folded. I just simply pull the two pieces, and I can tell that my binding is nice and flat. And so now I can just cut this off. I could take this to my iron and iron that open. At this point in my binding, I just want to get it done. So I usually will just finger press it right here. Now, the reason that I left that gap, you might think that that would make it too short. It actually makes it perfect. So when I fold this and lay this out, it fits perfect. This is not too loose. If I would have lined the folded piece up with that very first piece and then cut this, I would have too much. It would be too loose and I would get a big pleat in my binding. I'm not sure how that works, but it works. And so I will just go back to where I ended. I do need to move my needle because I've been sewing in a, with it not in the center. So I am going to move it back to 4.5. And then I will go ahead and back stitch, finish this off, and this will just sew nice, and I'll have my binding done for the first step. I've pressed, and so you can see that it just lays nice towards the outside of the quilt. And now I'm ready to do the corners. So I need to just make a nice mitered corner in the corners with the binding. And so what I usually do is fold down one edge. This will just continue to fold. And then I will fold up the other edge. So there, that just goes straight across. And I will take that, and my goal is for where this fold of this top fabric meets with the edge of this fabric, I want that to meet along the fold for a nice mitered corner. Like that. And that looks really good. Most of the time I try both ways. I'll try folding this side first and then, you know, wrapping this one over like I just did. If that doesn't lay nice and flat, I will open it up. Then I can try doing the opposite. I'll fold this side first and then fold this over and see which to me looks better, feels flat. They're both pretty much the same, and that's good. Usually there is one side that folds and lays nicer. Maybe not sewing at the very end helps. I'm not really sure, but either way I do that, and I will check on all four corners, whichever again lays nicer and flatter, looks good. That's what I'm going for. So I have my four corners done, and I just have them clipped. And I wanted to mention that on the ties, when I was stitching the binding onto the back, I went ahead and back stitched and then stitched when I was doing that. I didn't want to add more stitching when I fold my binding over and back stitch, because then I would have 3 lines of stitching and I want my binding to be just nice and clean. So I did a little bit of stabilizing because, you know, the whole quilt's going to be hanging from these, and so I wanted to make sure that those had extra stitches. All right, so now that I am ready with my corners, what I am going to do is glue based. I know most people don't do this. I have had really good luck doing it. And so I am simply going to take, this time I'm just going to use my Roxanne's glue basted. It's just like a white glue. It's washable. And I am going to, I'm not going to go in the corner yet. I am just going to put a little bit, not a lot, just a little, you know, thin line closer to the edge. And then when I fold it down, I am going to bring my little iron and I am just going to heat set, and this will dry. And it will keep it nice, ready for me to top stitch. See how nice that looks? And I'll do the corners after I do, you know, a section of both, so that I have that pressed down and then I only have to worry about the corner. So for this one, I'll just start, you know, down a few inches and just run a line. And then once that cools, I will do this corner. Now I'll do it the same. I'll kind of open. With that clip down, it was able to kind of press where I needed this corner to be. And so I will just put glue on the edge of the quilt, and when I fold this one down, I'm going to add a little bit of glue to this part of the binding that folds on top. my corner, and then I will just work my way around the whole quilt. I am done top stitching all around, and this looks great. I just did a top stitch right along the fold of the binding. Here's what the corner looks like. I love it. It's such a cute little wall hanging. Now here are the two ties. So they're sewn in like this, and then they will just get flipped up and tied around what I hang my little quilt on. So it just pulls up like that. And of course I have that on both sides. And basically our top is done. Now there are a few other things that I need to do. I will do that in the next video. That is with the eyelets that are spread throughout every block in this quilt. And then there are two little three-dimensional items that we need to sew. And we'll do that on the next video.